Welcome back to A Complete History of Manchester United. I'm your host, Wayne Barton, author and producer of several Manchester United books and films, joined as always on this journey by the legendary retired journalist and football writer, Paddy Barclay, to take you on this journey through Old Trafford history. If you're watching the video, please give it a like and subscribe. Join in the conversation in the comment section. If you're listening back on the audio podcast, please be sure to give a subscription and a review on the platform you listen on. And obviously, while you're here, once you've watched this episode, you can go back and enjoy between 30 minutes and 2 hours of any other season in Manchester United history as well, depending on how the mood took us on that particular day. Yeah. And by the way, it doesn't always have to be the most eventful season that gets stuck in for a long time. Anything can happen.
It's all quite unpredictable.
So the summer of 1962, Paddy, another World Cup summer. This one in Chile. Brazil knocked out England on their way to success. Brazil and Czechoslovakia contested the final. Brazil coming out on top. Notable because we've talked about formation changes a lot, and I know that in the last World Cup, obviously Brazil had been pioneering this four-man defence. Well, both of the teams in the final played four-man defences this time round with two dedicated centre-backs. Brazil coming out on top. They played a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-4, probably more a 4-2-4, knowing the Brazilians. And the Czech played a 4-3-3. There was some Scottish presence in the final. Bobby Davidson was one of the linesmen, so a great year for Scottish influences in football. Obviously, Dundee winning the league as well. We've got to give a little mention to that because I don't think we quite mentioned it enough in the last episode.
only for about an hour. But we went on to play. Dundee went on to play in the European Cup in this season that we're talking about, 62-3. Did okay, did very well. Got to the semi-finals, knocked out by the eventual champions Milan. So it was another happy season for me. But for Manchester United, it was extraordinary. It was. I think it's not a deal. It's not going to ruin the program's suspense for anybody United fan watching this to know that it has a happy ending. But my word, it had a pretty sticky start, Wayne, didn't it?
Yeah, and a strange one as well, because we've talked about these campaigns of two offs with Busby, and there are a few of them, but this one isn't really that. It's like, well, it kind of is, but more to do with the cup run rather than anything else, because the start to the campaign is disastrous. They lose 9 from the first 14 games. They're conceding too many goals, looking unsure in midfield. And really, United, they get a bit of an upturn of form in the autumn, so they sort of stabilised a little bit.
Yeah.
But the sort of divide in the season is caused by the weather, isn't it? It's the coldest winter, and
of the 20th century it was, and United didn't play from Boxing Day when they won 1-0 at an already ominously frosty Fulham down by the river there at Craven Cottage, narrow 1-0 win. And from Boxing Day, the next game was February the 23rd, which was a home draw with Blackpool, and notable for the debut of a player who was to prove highly significant in not only this season, but in Manchester United's history. A player from Scotland.
Yeah. Before we get to that, there was a couple of things. Obviously, this was a transfer that happened in the break, in the time that United didn't have a game. But before they even signed this player, they had an ongoing claim for compensation against British Airways as a result of, obviously, the Munich air disaster. Now, United had been claiming £273,000, and most of that based on the value of the players that perished. It's interesting because we go back to 1951, 1952, when Busby made this claim that he had £200,000 worth of players in reserve, really, and it's so interesting that value comes up as such a clinical figure here, because by the time of 1958 it was widely accepted. There was one story that was saying that Tommy Taylor could go for maybe treble figures, that coming up to £100,000. So he was even looking a little bit a lot conservative from Busby's estimate, really. But this was the figure that was basically used in court, 273,000, not in court, sorry, in the legal claim at the start, 273,000. But it was settled in the January of 1963 for £35,000. The MEN, their line from this was the £35,000 does not represent the value to United of even one of the several of their star international players. And they've cited Edwards and Taylor, obviously. But Harold Ordman said, "We are satisfied that if we'd pressed for a higher amount and gone into court, we do not know what would have happened." And I think that the general consensus, Paddy, was that because it was such a difficult thing to sort of put blame on people. It was such an emotional experience that nobody really wanted it to go to court. And you know, when you're talking about the clinical thing of figures and everything like that, there has been this long campaign against the pilot. You know, he'd had to sort of fight to absolve himself of any blame, and so to put this kind of thing through a public spectacle wouldn't have been becoming for anyone, would it? Really?
No, definitely not. And I mean, how on earth you put a price on the value of these players? I mean, how do you compare the footballing value with the loss of the bereavement of their families? You know, it is, as you say, it's a very uncomfortable subject, and probably you know, the question of blame was shifted from England to Germany and so on, and I'm sure that Hardman spoke for everybody when he said, you know, take it. There's one further factor which would have come in terms of the public perception of it, of the rights and wrongs of it. It would have been that United had just paid a record fee of 115,000 for Denis Law.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is not the behaviour of an impoverished club. You can, you know, that's how it would have been portrayed, I think, in some quarters. So, it's probably just a good idea to move on, really, and put the whole question of trying to put a value on that team who died to bed, really.
Yeah. I wonder how much of this played a part in the sort of consequential struggles that United would face. This is a podcast where we talk mainly about the football and what happened on the pitch.
Yes, but it was an unhappy club, relatively speaking, Wayne, at that time. I mean, there were feuds, as you know, as usual, there was tension between Busby and the board and the players in the post-maximum wage era about how much they should be paid. And there were sort of cliques. I mean, Busby had set out after the war to build a family, not a football club. And yet there were cliques beginning to break out. We mentioned last week the tension between a dressing room greatly influenced by the West Ham graduate Cantwell and the rather old school training regime of Jack Crompton. But there were also Bill Foulkes didn't get on with Harry Gregg. Harry used to disparagingly refer to him as Popular Bill, and because Bill could be a taciturn fellow on his day, and you know, other cliques forming and so on. I mean, when Denis Law came, he said, "Listen, I just rose above it. I was just so happy to be out of Italy, which didn't suit his game at all, and to be back in Manchester. I just didn't care. I just went out and played my game, and sure enough, his goal scoring record was fantastic over the season. But yeah, there was a lot of unhappiness around the place by Manchester, by the standards which had been set by Busby, certainly. And I think that contributed that a pretty poor dressing room contributed to the poor results, though they did improve after the enforced winter break of 2 months.
Yeah. And the other thing as well.
Eventually it did.
Yeah.
Should I say?
The other thing that we should mention, although I did say, and will remain true to being a football on the pitch podcast, the other issue that was sort of emanating, I'm only mentioning it because it would be sort of rude and almost negligent to not mention it, that because of the compensation claim
Yeah.
and because United were having this sort of, it was not obviously an ongoing dialogue with the survivors' families, and the survivors' families
Yeah.
were always a little bit disgruntled by
Yeah.
how little they received in way of compensation, and that never. I mean, that continued every. I mean, even 1998. I remember when they arranged a testimonial event for it,
That's
and
right.
this carried on for years. And we don't
Yes.
want to downplay their. We're talking about an emotional thing and a human loss. You don't want to downplay that. So I'm just mentioning that obviously that was ongoing and probably still to this day rankles with some of the surviving family members of those.
Yes, the families, the Blanchflower, Berry, Scanlon families, I'm sure, and the former players themselves
Yeah.
felt that they weren't. I think probably if you look back on it, and it's very easy to be wise after the event, but the club was underinsured.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah. That's something you mentioned in one of the previous. Also,
Yeah,
the other thing was when we talk about it being unbecoming, the fact was that Busby was about to go into the transfer market and spend a hell of a lot of money again straight after
yeah.
the Denis Law thing. So let's talk about that that big buy that he'd made in early
Mm,
February. So a week after Paddy Crerand, a halfback in Celtic, puts in a transfer request. He moves to Manchester for £56,000. I mean, Crerand, this is a midfielder with style and class,
mhm.
passing quality that sets him apart. And he talked about the personality of the dressing room and everything, and the cliques that were forming. Busby was desperate for this kind of personality to come in,
Yeah,
and Paddy Crerand had it in spades. He also had a confidence about his play. We've talked about Mark Pearson, we've talked about Alex Dawson, and maybe the graduation to this kind of big stage was
mm,
you could see the pressure on their shoulders
mm.
basically. Where Crerand wasn't going to have any of that.
No,
Um,
not as a footballer. He claimed that he was. Oh, I'm going to Manchester because you know how it happened. He'd put in this transfer request at Celtic, and he'd just been to mass one Sunday, and there's a knock on the door, and he opens the door, and there's a man who we in the journalistic community knew as the Jolly. His name was Roger, Jim Roger. And up in Scotland, he was a complete legend. He worked for the Daily Record, but he wasn't much of a writer, but he just made stories. He made stories for his newspaper by arranging transfers. I mean, he was basically the fixer of Scottish football. And so he knocks on, and Paddy says, "Oh, come in," and he says, "Oh, son," he says, he always called everybody son. He says, "Son, you're going to Manchester United." He didn't say you might be going to Manchester. It's a bit like Ferguson ringing up David Moyes and saying, "Oh, you're going to be the next United manager." He didn't say, "Would you like to be the next?" It was just, "Yeah, that's it." He says, "You're going to Man United, son," and Paddy claimed that he'd never been out of Scotland hardly, except to go on holidays in Ireland. Oh, Manchester, I'm going to be, fish out of water there. What's it like, and all that. Wow. I don't think he was, and certainly as far as the dressing room was concerned, he was no naive. He was very sure of himself. I mean, an example of his quality, or an illustration of his quality, was that at the same time, Jim Baxter of Rangers, one of the best, most talented midfield players Scotland has ever seen, was also known to be available. And so Matt went to Denis and said, "Which of those two would you rather serve you from midfield?" And Dennis loved Jim Baxter. Everybody loved Jim Baxter. And he was, he's a cheeky, lovely, what the Scots call gallus type, not arrogant, but cocky, and fantastic footballer. I mean, he was picked, I think, twice for the rest of the world 11s. He was, imagine a Scottish player getting in one of those now. And apart from Scott McTominay, Wayne, before you leap in there, so Jim Baxter was a fantastic player, but Dennis, being a mate of his, knew that he liked the Bacardi and Coke a little bit too much. And so Dennis said, I think Paddy Creran would be more reliable. And he was proved right because, of course, Jim Baxter went down to Nottingham Forest, Sunderland, I think, at first. And then he went on to Nottingham Forest, paid £100,000 for him. But within a year, he'd been sent back to Scotland on a free. So it was definitely a good decision to pick the more of a family man, Paddy Creran. And sure enough, Paddy came down to Ringway Airport with Noreen, his wife, and there was Matt with Dennis and Diana, his wife. So this really helped Paddy to settle in. Although actually, when the winter relented, and he did make his debut, that it wasn't exactly. United didn't exactly cover themselves in glory. Took 2 points from Paddy's first 6 games, and one or two of the fans were saying, is this guy really any better than Nobby Lawton? Well, after his first few games, he definitely proved. Nobby Lawton was actually sold for 11,500, and it became clear that this man was definitely part of a very exciting new Manchester United team.
Yeah, you mentioned Greg's comments about Bill Foulkes. Greg's probably going to feature a few times in this episode as well. He had a great quote, or a couple on Paddy Creran as well. He said, "I could run backwards faster than he could sprint."
But no, this is true. No, if you were to list Paddy's attributes as a player, it'd take you quite a long time, but you certainly wouldn't dwell on his pace much. Although, funnily enough, and when we get to the climax of the FA Cup campaign, we may have an interesting thing to say about Paddy and his pace. But by and large, no, very, very slow, and but incredibly good in every other way, including, he was always. Manchester United would never be out physiqued as long as he was around. He was tough, and if you add him to Morris Setters, you. In fact, it frustrated Busby that United was still leaking goals, even with this fantastic barrier in the midfield of these two real tough guys. Not to mention Noel Cantwell at the back. Bill Foulkes, they should not have continued to leak goals, and then it frustrated Busby, and he couldn't really work out why, because he thought, I've now assembled a team that is ready to go like this.
Yeah.
But eventually it did turn, and the FA Cup campaign, when I think was was how it happened, wasn't it?
Yeah, you're quite right about Creran's introduction in terms of the league. They'd had a run just before Christmas of just one defeat in 9, but then the second half of the season was almost catastrophic again. Shipping goals everywhere. One clean sheet in the league in 1963. Clean sheet, and only a handful in the entire season. I think there was a run of 6 defeats in 8 games at one point. So United really snowballing down the league. Well, not snowballing down the league. They were remaining at the foot of the league.
They were actually at the bottom at one for a week, weren't they?
Actually, for a little while. We'll talk about it when they get to the cup run. But the fact that they were in such a struggle was cited as a positive reason for how they performed in the cup run, because
I
they
see.
were having something to compete for.
Yes.
The players' pride being a little bit stung as they were going along. So yeah, they would have to find success in the FA Cup because they declined to enter the League Cup again.
Yeah.
A lot of these games, because of the cold winter, or the March must have been the busiest month on record because of how many games were played.
Yeah.
They United were playing games every week in the cup in March, the third round, the fourth round, the fifth round, and getting through to get to semi-final and then all the way to the final. But still, the league form desperately poor. United really fighting to avoid relegation unthinkably, but they were. And this came against the backdrop because people were worrying. Not worrying, they were wondering about why is the United team who's packed with this much talent and have been backed with money, why are they struggling at the foot of the table? So when, in April, match-fixing allegations started to sprout in football, United was seen as one of the prime candidates for this. Sheffield Wednesday were embroiled in it, and they had some players charged. Harry Gregg remembered saying to Joe Carolan, who we know from previous episodes, is full who's been in the first team, but now in the reserves. Joe Carolan went to visit him and basically said, "Have they been to see you yet?" And he was basically referring to the people who were involved in match fixing, and Greg would have none of it. And if he'd have been aware of it happening in the United side, he would have been one of the characters who would have stood up and spoke about it.
Yes, he would.
But it was definitely happening in football. A lot of players were found guilty, and to tie this back to United, there was this concern that United are playing so poorly, it must be right for United.
Yes, exactly. Well, Busby, I think I touched on it perhaps a bit early last week that Busby, when it was brought to his attention by the Daily Mail that Manchester United, the finger of suspicion had been pointed at the United dressing room, he muttered under his breath, "I knew it. I knew it." And anyway, he did. Manchester United did manage to escape unscathed from that. But as you rightly point out, the taint was largely centred on Sheffield Wednesday, three of whose outstanding players were named and shamed by, I think it was the People newspaper. For match fixing. Peter Swan, superb England centre half. Tony Kay, a midfield player, good, very, very good, again, international class midfield player, and a centre forward called David Bronco Lane, known as Bronco because after a Western film character, television character, David Lane, all were exposed and all later went to prison. So, yes, there was a lot of suspicion around at that time, and there were lots of as well as the actual money that changed hands, there were a lot of hints at it to unsettle people. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence of people whispering, "Hey, there's 20 quid to throw the game," to try and put people off. So it was a dirty it was a murky atmosphere at that time. But anyway, what's needed to lift the gloom and the cynicism is a good cup run, and United certainly had that. Among the vanquished, I think it was in the quarterfinal, a buoyant Coventry City. Jimmy Hill, having contributed, very obviously to the smashing of the maximum wage, was now leading Coventry City, and they were one of the teams United had to overcome in the quarterfinals of the cup. But yes, United went on. Who did they play in the semis?
Southampton. Denis Law proving decisive again. Like you said, he'd settled into life at United, scoring plenty of goals. Scored a hat-trick against his old club, Huddersfield, in the third round as well.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So something of a... when you get something like that happening with Denis Law, obviously scoring those goals, I think he scored against Chelsea as well in the fifth round. So you having this feeling that, you know, as cup runs often do, there might be a little bit of destiny attached to it. But it wouldn't be a cup final for Manchester United without a bit of goalkeeper trouble, Paddy. And we've got it again. We've got it again. But it was the Monday prior to the cup final, basically. The last league game of the season was at Nottingham Forest, and Busby named his team to go to this game. And it was kind of like the squad. Obviously, some key players would still travel, but he was looking to rest as many as he could, really. Busby having invented squad rotation, as we mentioned previously. And there are a few players who were thinking, I really don't want to make this trip because it means I'm not going to be playing at Wembley. Frank Haydock was one. Shea Brennan, who playing at half-back usually, knew that Tony Dunn had sort of stepped in at right back now, and he was playing really well there. And Cantwell had sort of took his place at left back, so there was a place for Brennan from half back. And Brennan knew that if he was playing half back at Forest, which he was unlikely to be in the squad for Wembley. Nobby Stiles and Dennis Walker. We'll talk about Dennis Walker more in a moment because he's very notable for a couple of reasons. But Nobby Stiles. So he picked up an injury at Forest, and we had previously told to him about he'd done the usual. This was the Busby way, wasn't it? If he was critical of a player's performance,
how do you think you did? And of course, nobody ever thinks they played 100% games. So he's not bad. I could have done. I think you could do with a rest. That was his way of dropping players. So Nobby got that impossible question. Have you stopped beating your wife? Question.
Yeah, and so that was that was prior to the Forest game, I believe, and then he picked up an injury in the Forest game, and
that was a hamstring as well. So not good.
I think he was frustrated at the fact that he'd had to go to Forest to try and. I think he was a little bit eager to try and make the cup final team, believing there was still a chance to do so. And then he was obviously a little bit, more than a little bit disgruntled after, because the injury was used as the reason to say. Because I think Busby came out after the Forest game, after he picked up the injury, and said, "Oh, you would have been in my team, son." So Styles was even more frustrated that he'd think.
Oh dear.
We get to the goalkeeper situation. Harry Gregg, meanwhile, had been playing reserve team football because he'd had this long-standing shoulder complaint. Now, he'd been out of the team for he played the start of the season. Gaskell was the reserve team goalkeeper, but Gaskell had come into the first team now through Gregg's shoulder complaints. Ronnie Briggs, as you'll remember, as standing who was never going to be a serious contender to replace either of them in the first team. He'd been the reserve team goalkeeper up until maybe the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season, when Gregg, under the belief that he could sort of take, there was some suggestion he was taking painkillers, and they wanted him to have injections or something for the shoulder injury. And Gregg had sort of fought against that, railed against it, but had this idea put into his head that if he did, he'd be ready for the final. In the end, that wasn't the case. He wasn't selected. He wasn't very happy about it, to be honest. I remember when, I'm sure he said the same to you in private conversations, and I don't think it's too much of a secret to leak that Gregg was not very happy about missing out of the 63 final. Stiles, meanwhile, never unhappy enough to actually complain about Busby, but he did observed growing tensions with Johnny Giles and Busby. They were, Stiles and Giles, really close because Giles was married to Nobby's sister, I believe.
That was about to be,
about to be. Giles, in training, had the Johnny Morris treatment from Busby, where he basically, Busby had asked him what he thought the role of a winger was, and Giles said, "Well, I thought it was to get to the byline and cross the ball like Johnny Berry did." And Busby said, "Well, why don't you try coming inside and beating your man?" And as we know, obviously, if Busby was doing that, if he was intervening on that level, he was obviously doing it for good reason. Although Stiles his recollection on this was always interesting, because he was shocked that Giles and Busby didn't get on. But this was obviously the start of an issue that was going to prove terminal to their relationship.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you see, Giles, sorry to interrupt, Wayne, but Giles had this person, he had the Johnny Morris type personality, you know. he was a challenger, you know, and so consequently, there was one time at around the time that you're talking about where Busby did the usual thing, you know. He asked him after a game, how do you think you played? Because he was obviously planning to leave him out for probably Quicksall.
Yeah.
And Giles, you see, being smart, says to him, well, boss, how did you think I played? So Busby says, well, not bad, actually. He says, well, why are you dropping me then? Which nobody had done that to Busby before. So that just kind of, you know, Busby, you know, is his opinion that this kid is a bit of a smart ass, you know. And Giles does admit that he got that from his dad, because he told a story about when he was a kid. His dad would idolize Stanley Matthews, and they met. He took his little boy, Johnny Giles, to meet Stanley Matthews. And Matthews was charming and gave him his autograph or whatever it was. And they went away, and little Johnny looks up at his dad and says, wasn't it, what a nice man Stanley Matthews is for talking to us. And his dad says, yeah, but he knows bugger all about football. So it obviously runs in the family. And so while Giles was kicking back against Busby, and Busby was thinking, hang on, who's the manager of this club, you know? It was never going to work in the long term. But Giles did turn in some good performances, and was to end up with, you know, quite a lot to be pleased about in the season.
Yeah, Giles, by the way, he made that trip to Forest, so he would have probably been thinking, I'm going to be cut from the final team. As it turned out, he wasn't. He was in the final team. I'll put the team up in a moment. And in fact, I'll put it up now, and you'll see. I know that I normally put the tactics at the end, so obviously this is for people watching the video podcast. When I put the tactics up, and I'll be putting different versions of this up, because I'm putting the FA Cup team and the usual team through the season.
Normal league team,
but this lineup, which was on the BBC, obviously, you know, before the match, they put the graphic up of how the team is assembled. So you'll see on the screen there. It's a bit.
So grainy. For those who are listening in black and white, audio only, it's Gaskell. Then it's, as usual, it's two at the back, as always in programs and so on. Dunn and Cantwell as the fullbacks. Then there's Crerand and Setters as the wing halves, with Bill Foulkes between them, although he would in fact have played between Dunn and Cantwell. Then the inside forwards, Quicksall and Law. Giles at outside right, David Herd centre forward, and Bobby Charlton outside left.
Yeah. That's it's shown on the screen just to show, like as Paddy quite rightly said there, that Bill Foulkes is still shown in the half-back line. It looks like a defensive midfielder. So even by 1963 standards, they're still showing it the same way. But it's basically a 3-2-2-3 at that time.
And I think in Busby's mind, if he might have been minded to put Quicksall to the right wing, have Styles in midfield, and leave out Giles. That would have probably been his inkling. Otherwise,
he almost thought for a moment that he was going to be playing without Paddy Crerand, because he was giving the team talk. Paddy Crerand was not present. Harry Gregg remembered how Crerand had basically said that the big cup final tradition was the pre-match "Abide with me." It resonated around Wembley Stadium, and he'd heard about how it was such a special thing to experience in football. Paddy, being Paddy, wanted to experience it for himself. Didn't want to be sat in the dressing room while it was going on. So when Busby called for him, he was like, "Where's Paddy?" Paddy's outside listening with the fans, or joining in with the fans.
When you first told me that story, Wayne, I was thinking about it, and I wondered if he'd sort of said, "Boss, you know, I'm a Christian and I would love to experience this." And Busby said yes. But it wasn't like Paddy just went. Is that right?
Yeah. They turned up, obviously. Obviously, whatever he missed wasn't too vital because Paddy's influence in the cup final is
No.
remarkable, really. And this really is where Busby's his nous for really knowing what
Yes.
was best for United came in, because he did select this team with experience. He benefited. I mean, Setters and Cantwell are the beneficiaries of Brennan and Styles missing out, because obviously Brennan would have played in the half-back line. Well, if you look at what happened at Forest, he would have played in the half-back line, so he wasn't going to play in this. It took a while for United to get settled in the cup final. They're playing against Leicester City. Leicester City had sort of cantered towards the end of the season. They weren't playing for anything, but they should have been 3 goals up, really. And this was another thing, not the match
they were
fixing.
the favourites, Wayne, because they'd finished 4th, and United had been struggling. So yeah. Sorry, yes, go on.
But they should have been, because they were obviously in dominant form in the early stages. They should have been 3-0 up. And where we're talking about uncertainty over over players and the reliability. Now, I'm not saying this about David Gaskell at all, but people were looking at his position in the first 15 minutes and thinking, God, he's not in good shape here. But I think you would attribute that to nerves. He was not looking really good at the start. Leicester
he was trying to conquer his nerves by being sort of overconfident, if you see what I mean. I've seen the film of it, and one thing I noticed was that at one stage he comes out and he claims a high ball, and already his eyes are on what he's going to do with the ball, in terms of rolling it out. And he makes the classic schoolboy error of taking his eye off the ball, and the ball bobbles over his shoulder. Luckily, it drops where he can safely grab it. And there's Busby and Matt Gillis, I think, is it, leading the teams out? Yes. Now we're talking goalkeepers. If we can, what Wayne's just done is show the teams walking out, led out by their managers, and the second of the Leicester players, Leicester playing all in white because they'd lost the toss for strip, and their goalkeeper is a very familiar face, one Gordon Banks. And if we're talking about this cup final, yes, David Gaskell did have a shaky start. When he dropped the ball incidentally over his shoulder, luckily it just bounced and he was able to collect it. And there was a look of relief on his face that made you think, well, he's going to calm down now and be more. But in fact, he didn't. However, the great unspoken word about this game is that Gaskell was the better of the 2 goalkeepers. Banks had an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
It's been rewritten out of history because the late Gordon Banks, of course, is rightly seen as one of England's greatest goalkeepers of all time, and possibly the author of the greatest save of all time. And he'd been just, he was about to be made England's goalkeeper by the new manager, Alf Ramsey. And yet he had one of the biggest Wembley nightmares of all time in this game. However, let's deal with that as and when we come to it.
Yeah, I mean, after that shaky start, obviously Leicester looking like they were dominant, but United, it's the unwritten rule of cup finals, isn't it? You've got to score when you're on top, because if you don't, the disaster can strike, as it did for Leicester when Denis Law. I mean, Crerand had already started to take hold of the game at this point. United, they were benefiting from the experience. Busby, the clinical use of putting the experience of like Crerand and Setters and Cantwell in, it was really starting to pay off once United were settled. And Denis Law, we talk about things that don't really get mentioned. His goal in this cup final is magnificent, and it completely changed.
In my opinion, it's the most underrated goal ever scored in a cup final. I mean, there've probably been better goals, but I don't think any has ever received not being given as much credit as this one. And as you rightly say, Crerand was beginning to become the dominant figure in the game. And it was about half an hour had gone. And one of the Leicester players took a throw, and it was a bit off target, and Creran's brain took him there. And this is why I was laughing about pace, because sometimes class makes you look quicker than you are. And this was a perfect example, because the trajectory of his run, he took the ball from the loose throw, and his momentum carried him into the kind of position you would expect an outside left, just to the left of the penalty box. And can I just dwell on the goal here, because I wrote about it. And the midfielder's change of pace, and believe you me, that's Creran, because of the momentum of his run, took him deep into the penalty area, where he gently squared the ball. Law let it pass between Norman and Appleton, between the two defenders, and let it run behind him, while smoothly turning onto his right foot. And then, instead of shooting where Banks would have expected it, again rolled it between Norman and Appleton, who were running back, fireman late to the fire, and rolled it back between them into a corner where the goalkeeper had no chance of getting it. The roar was deafening, as you often get with a goal where, will he, won't he, what's he doing? And it just rolls into the net. One of those sort of drawn out finishes. But Denis knew exactly what he was doing. And the roar was fantastic, and United were on their way. And in the second half, Charlton tried a shot. It wasn't much of a shot, but Banks spilled it. And David Hurd scored the first of two, what were to prove to him, two easy goals, both caused by faults by Gordon Banks. Keyworth reduced the deficit, but when United Hurd got his second goal, that was it, 3-1, and that was after Law had done a brilliant thing. He played a 1-2 with Hurd and headed against the post, and Hurd then profited again. So that was a terrific end to the season, and Law's goal was his 29th in 44 appearances, which is not bad, is it?
Wow. It's pretty good.
And Her Majesty the Queen handed the cup to the man who was now United's captain in succession to Maurice Setters. There he is, big Noel Cantwell, placing the crown on Albert Quicksall's head. David Hurd has the what do you call it? Plinth? Whatever the cup rests on. Paddy Creran's trying to put it on his head. Bobby Charlton's looking miserable as usual. And there's John Giles. And he is being almost consoled by Maurice Setters, as if, he's thinking, he said something about, well, how's Busby going to react to that? Because he had a good game, John Giles. So there we are, jubilation. And United's first trophy since Munich.
Yeah. Maybe that's played into a little bit of Gaskell's early nerves, because if you look back through the years, obviously we talked about United's infamous struggle with goalkeepers in cup finals. They'd also the 57 and 58 finals being not expected to win in 58, but maybe a public wave of momentum thinking that they stood more of a chance than what they did. And obviously in both of those finals, they suffered goalkeeper trouble in the game as well. So maybe you've got Gaskell worrying about that. And you can imagine what the emotion must have been like once Lowe scored, because it was the first time that United had been ahead in a cup final since that late burst in 48. So to finally have this sort of feeling that a cup is there to be won and the heartache is finally over, both in the post-Munich years, but also the cup final lack of luck that they'd suffered in previous years. So they finally got over that, and then the jubilation that they would have had with Hurd twice, giving them a 2-goal lead. There are a couple of things notable in the aftermath. Like we said earlier on, or hinted at earlier, it was observed that United's pride had been hurt in the sort of difficult underperformance in the league, where they were having to work so hard to avoid relegation, that it had actually helped their focus in the closing weeks of the season, because they had something to play for, and something with the cup final, obviously a massive showpiece occasion to show that they could be better than what the league position suggested. Whereas Leicester, once they'd done so well and they had overachieved for themselves, but towards the end of the season they had little to play for, because they weren't going to win the league and they weren't going to get relegated, and they were all looking forward to the cup final. They obviously had that problem of having a few weeks to look forward to the cup final, unfortunately. Whereas United were a little bit sharper in their focus. Colin Appleton, who was the Leicester skipper, said after the match, "I can't understand how that team finished where they did in the league," which sort of says it all in terms of what United had gone through that season. So we'll go through the squad then and the statistics for this season. Put Pat Crowne up first, but we'll get to him in a little while. We're going to go through the rest of the team first. Harry Gregg was the first choice when available, 28 appearances and 24 of those in the league. But Gaskell obviously came through as Gregg had his injuries, 20 appearances and 18 of those in the league. Shea Brennan would have felt notably aggrieved at missing out playing. Obviously played a lot of games at halfback as well, but he played 41 games in all competitions and 37 in the league. Cantwell, 30 appearances in all competitions, 1 goal, 25 and 1 in the league. Tony Dunn, now making his position the right back slot, while Cantwell was at left back. Dunn played 25 in the league, 28 in all competitions. Pat Crerand, after signing, played 22 games, 19 of those were in the league. Bill Folks, 47 appearances in all competitions, 41 of those in the league. So he only missed a single game all season. Frank Haydock making a single league appearance. Nobby Lowton, before his sale, 12 appearances in the league. Jimmy Nicholson with 10 league appearances as well. Maurice Setters with 1 goal in 33 appearances, 27 of those appearances in the league, the goals in the league as well. Nobby Stiles scored 2 goals in 35 appearances, both of those goals in the league in 31 appearances. So a really good contribution from Nobby Stiles, and yeah, he would have probably felt a little bit sad to have missed out on that cup final. As it turned out, he wouldn't get another chance. So when these cup finals, I know United had 3 in 5 years now, 5 or 6 years. So you might have thought that they come around more often. As often as an embarrassing exit to Sheffield Wednesday in early rounds. But yeah, there wouldn't be another chance for Nobby Stiles, unfortunately. Brings us to the forward line. We talked about Denis Law earlier on. He was the top goal scorer this season with 29 in 44, 23 in 38 in the league. Bobby Charlton, 9 goals in 34 appearances, 7 in 28 in the league. Phil Chisnall made 6 appearances and scored a single goal in the league. And Johnny Giles, 5 in 42, 4 in 36 in the league. Hurd, after an impressive debut season where he'd been the top goal scorer, now he's moving into this sort of secondary role, even though he scores 2 goals in the cup final, the decisive goals as well. 21 goals in 43 games, 19 in 37. Quicksall, the other main player in that forward line this season, 11 in 36, 7 in 31 in the league. And the other sort of peripheral squad members, Ian Meyer, we talked about him in previous episodes, just 1 goal in 9 league appearances, having looked so promising earlier on in his career, and now a peripheral figure at the moment. Sammy McMillan, 4 league appearances without a single goal. This brings us to the last player on the list who, like Haydock, made only 1 single appearance, but very notable for a couple of reasons. Dennis Walker, the first black player to represent Manchester United. He came through the youth system. He was one of the players who played in that much changed team down at Nottingham Forest in the build-up to the FA Cup final. So obviously very notable for his role in pioneering being the first black player for United. It'd take a while for the second one, by the way, so shouldn't discount that. And yeah, he come through the ranks, very popular with the players as well. But not his only notable place in Manchester history. And if you don't know the story of Dennis Walker, you'll be blown away by this. Following retirement as a player, he worked in security, and he was working at the Arndale Centre on the morning of June the 15th, 1996. He was notified of a threat from the IRA just before 10 a.m. That a bomb would detonate in 90 minutes' time. It's important to remember that at the time, especially in Manchester and Liverpool, you'd get a lot of these hoax calls.
Yeah.
So you could easily dismiss it. And they happened at football matches as well. I mean, we'll come to it in due course, but I mean, players' careers were affected by this. And some people with religious beliefs and backgrounds, people who were associated with new people in the IRA, they'd have different levels of seriousness with how they treat this. Some people would say it's deadly serious. Other people would say it's a hoax. People are just messing about. So you could have easily dismissed this as a hoax. Dennis decided not to do that. He worked with his team to successfully evacuate the Arndale Centre. I believe there might have been even more than 50,000 people there at the time, but they successfully evacuated it. And of course, on this occasion, it wasn't a hoax. There was a bomb, and it did go off. And it was thanks to Dennis's work that there were no deaths.
Yeah.
The story doesn't end there, because I mean that is heroism by itself, to sort of take it seriously and to be so proactive, to do this like within the space of 90 minutes to completely clear the centre. But as he was leaving the centre, it shows you how close it was to sort of in getting this done. Really, as he was leaving the centre, following the final check, the bomb went off, and it blew Dennis across the road. It's hard to explain if you haven't been to Manchester. It's a fair old way to travel from across the road from where the Arndale is.
Yeah.
There's a main road. There's a road and there's a tram track there now. So it's a big distance to sort of travel in the air. But the explosion blew Dennis across the road and he hit Debenham's window. Thankfully, like all of the people in Manchester, survived. Thanks to his heroism, and just it's incredible when you think, Paddy, of like, yes, he's already got his place in history, but to do a heroic act like that is just people don't know about that, Dennis Walker.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, maybe there was because they had different code words, and he may have been advised that this was a serious threat because a certain code word had been used in the call to the police. But I mean, it was an extraordinary evacuation that was done. Incidentally, I mean, I don't know, but I'll bet there were a lot of Germans among those evacuated, because Germany the German football fans were in town, and a lot of them, quite a few of them must have gone shopping on the day of, I think it was the day before they played the Soviet Union, or in Euro '96 at Old Trafford. So it was it's a remarkable story about Dennis Walker, and great to be reminded of him. He, as you rightly said, he'd come through the youth team, was very popular and highly rated, and such was the quality of what was coming through. Dennis was a winger, and there was a winger coming through at that time. In fact, when the team got back to their London hotel with the cup, Paddy Crerand remembered their coach returning to the hotel in London and Paddy remembered looking out of a top floor window, all excited. And Agog was one of the youth, they'd taken all the youth team down. And there was a little slim, dark-haired lad. And Paddy remembered him because he was supposed to be quite a good little player. And his name was George Best. And at the banquet afterwards, Harry, as you rightly say, Harry Gregg was miserable. Gaskell was having fun. And so Greg, who'd been left out, sort of chose a different table and didn't want to be, long faced in the middle of the celebrations. And this boy, this dark haired boy, George Best, walked over to him, obviously fellow Northern Irishman, and said, Harry, can I bring my daddy over to see you? And Harry Gregg says, no, I'll go over and see your dad. And he went over to speak to Dickie Best. And that was George Best. Although he was only just 17, his first team debut was only months away. So the Manchester United team in our next episode will include Law, Charlton, and Best. So if there is any doubt that a great new team is forming, I think that Holy Trinity will sweep it all away.
Let's have a look at how the team lined up then in this. We looked at the cup final team that was already there. So this is how they generally were in the league that season. Brennan had mostly played at right back before Dunn came into that position. Styles, obviously, Crerand, he was definitely a first team player. So don't let this representation sway your opinion on that. It's literally put in there to reflect. Styles had played 35 games and Crerand had played 22. Obviously, Styles got to be given his fair mention there. And the forward line pretty much the same for as it looked in the cup final lineup as well. You're quite right, Paddy. United red, white, and white again, but with the cup final being televised, they had to do a coin toss with Leicester because the blue shirts would look the same on black and white TV. Leicester lost the toss and had to wear white. United in their away strip of all white, which I'll just pop up here as well. You'll see a great picture that's just after Crerand came.
Yes.
And Harry Gregg not looking happy at all. Probably already aware that he's not going to be playing in the cup final. The average attendance this season, 41,297. Denis Law.
That's up.
Denis Law, top scorer, 3 hat-tricks as well in that 29. One time he even scored 4 goals, the 4 in a win at Ipswich. One of the hat-tricks, incidentally, in a loss at Leicester, 4-3. But he would get his revenge, obviously. Key result this season being the FA Cup win, Paddy, I think it's fair to say. Elsewhere in football, you've got Dundee's heroic European Cup run, which fell at the last. Everton won the league. City were relegated. Birmingham won the League Cup. Birmingham finished 1 place lower than United in the league, 1 place above relegation, where City were in the last relegation spot. So both of the cups going to teams on the periphery of relegation. But as you quite rightly say, United already regenerating in the youth team, and hopefully they'll have, not just youth players to show in the first team, but hopefully Jimmy Murphy can deliver on that FA Youth Cup promise that he made by Busby as well. Who knows what will happen in the next episode? If you're watching on the old YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe and join in the conversation in the comment section. If you're listening back to us on the audio podcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a review on the platform you're listening on.